heard him talk about Ernest until later on in his life, close to his death.
How about when his memoir came out?
His memoir, while very well written, was interesting also for me because, for one, my mother, myself, my brother Patrick, and my sister Maria, we were all cut out of the memoir. It was as if he'd tried to sort of pretend that we hadn't existed, and he just went on to his third wife. There was that. But then there was also the fact that he lopped off a whole decade of his life, in the sense that he said that he'd had this falling out with his father after his mother's death, and afterwards he never spoke to the man until that was it. There was no more conversation. But I discovered, however, doing the research in this book and using letters from my father to my grandfather, and recreating this dialectic that existed between them, was that there was always conversation going on. Even when they had their falling out periods, they were still talking about money matters and that sort of stuff. I mean, there was a very strong link between these men.
There was a time that John's father, Gregory, got arrested in Los Angeles, and your grandmother called Ernest, and Ernest came down on her and said, "Look, this is your fault. Look at the way you've raised him." And obviously she was very distraught. And then later that night she passed away in the hospital.
Yeah, that was, I would say, probably the crucial moment in my father's life, because at the time, my father didn't know this, Ernest didn't know this, but my grandmother was suffering from a rare form of pituitary cancer, and it meant that under conditions of extreme stress, her blood pressure would rise to very dangerous levels, and she could start hemorrhaging. Well, when my dad was arrested, she had been in San Francisco visiting her sister. She came down to Los Angeles. He'd gone into a women's bathroom in a movie theater in LA, and that was not something he did back in the 50s. They tended to really throw the book at you. He was in jail. She got him out of jail, bailed him, kept the press quiet. Well, that was the easy stuff. Then she had to call Ernest. And Ernest was, as you say, absolutely livid. He hit the roof, okay? Bitching at her for this, for that, everything. And the conversation ended after about an hour, and later on that evening she started hemorrhaging. And they rushed her to the hospital. Eventually she was taken to the operating room, surgeons frantically trying to find out where this hemorrhage was. And at about 2 in the morning, on October 1st, 1951, she died. My dad was really, really cut up about this. He was, in part because he realized, at least subconsciously, that he blamed himself, because if he hadn't been arrested, she never would have had to sort of call Ernest. This argument never would have happened. A lot of things could have changed. Ernest, at first, was very nice to my father. He invited my dad, his young wife, and their baby daughter to Cuba. Treated my dad's wife like a queen, took her out to all the locales that he went to, introduced her to all his important Cuban friends. It was a great trip. And then at the end of it, as they were, going up the ramp there onto the plane, take them back to Miami and then to LA, he stopped my dad and he said to him, using his nickname, "Gigi, you killed your mother with that stunt there in LA." And for my dad, this was like a ton of bricks of guilt falling down his shoulders. He didn't know what to say. He was really cut up about this. But it came out later on.
Let's read some of those letters. Could you read some of those for us? Here are some letters back and forth. That I wonder how much these letters, too, again, drew this push for you that the story needs to be told. Especially since this is a lot of the time that Greg in his memoir was saying that he wasn't talking to his father. Correct? Or?
Yeah, these letters were a real eye-opener for me, because not only did they prove that these two were always in communication with each other, but also that it at times could be a very dramatic relationship. Two men who, in my opinion, who were so similar, so alike, and who needed each other to such an extent that they reached that point where communication was virtually impossible. And this was after what happened with his mother there. And I write, Ernest must have answered with something that Greg didn't like. Because in his next letter, Greg wrote, "You ever write another letter like that and I'll beat the shit out of you." I haven't found the letter that Ernest wrote and can't say exactly what his words were. It had something to do with my Uncle Jack. That would be Margot's father, Marielle's father. But whatever it was set off a flood of anger in my father. And he said, "How can you tell such barefaced lies and make such unfounded accusations? You know Bum didn't write for the simple reason that Bum just doesn't write." Again, he's talking about his older brother Jack. Not a terrible fault at any means, but not one to be excused on the grounds that he is one of our heroes in khaki, and that anything a man does or doesn't do while in the army is all right as long as he discharges his official duties properly. A philosophy that you have hid behind for innumerable wars. And then referring to his mother, my grandmother, my dad says, "When Mother died and I first called, you accused me of killing her. When I brought down Jane to Cuba, you behaved so inhumanly that after the trip, I had to stop myself from crying for whole days. I know that you thought that you were doing all this for my own good, but I hate the way you did it. As far as I'm concerned, you can go to hell. If you want answers to any letters to me, make your own truthful and devoid of the epistles to the Californian shit. If we see each other again and you act nastily, I will fight and I will beat the shit out of you." Then, just to make things, keep things on that tone, 10 days later he wrote another letter. And he said, and this is where he really starts digging up all the various things that have been bothering him, perhaps for a long time. "I used to think that you were such a wonderful guy in the mornings when your head was clear, that whatever stupid, inane, illogical, ruthless, and to use your own word, chicken shit things you said later on in the day were excusable. And even must be sensible, because they were coming out of the same person who could be so human and sensitive in the morning. Well, oh boy, I'm sick of adding it all up, trying to balance things in your favor. Let me name a few things I'm tired of. One, your incessant castigation of Marty," that's Marty Gilhorn, "who is the second best wife you ever had after Bumby's mother. If ever there was a girl who was alive and with the capacity for enjoying things, it was Marty. She never bitched you without reason, never bitched you until you had made 1,001 tantramental scenes, made her so sick of you and so destroyed her love for you that she was delighted to leave you finally. Now she lives a peaceful, duller life in Mexico, where she no longer has to fare an illogical, torpid bull every morning. That is the big decision everyone who is close to you has to make eventually. Whether to stick and live for the few times when you are kind, perceptive, and human. And by sticking and waiting for these times, they undervaluate themselves and forget that in their own way they're twice as good as you.